Today I'm going to talk about my 2002 Honda CBR954RR that I bought in 2018 with 19,000 miles. So I've owned it for about 6 years and 4,000 miles. Today I'm going to give you my thoughts on it. So this was actually my second motorcycle I owned. The first one was a 1992 CBR954RR that I owned for one riding season, fixed up and flipped for a profit, so I didn't really get a ton of riding experience on it. Then I didn't own a bike for maybe 5 years, and I actually bought this one from the original owner. And it's really cool because I was able to get a bike that had basically no modifications outside of aftermarket blinkers. First off, why did I choose the 954? Well, as a young man with relatively little riding experience, naturally I was looking for the highest performance machine I could possibly get, which meant that I wanted a 1000cc Supersport. Next up, I chose Honda because while all Japanese brands are known for reliability and quality, Honda is known for it even more so, even amongst Japanese brands. So that's why I wanted to go with Honda. And then finally, why did I choose the 954 in particular? The one thing that always drew me to it early on was it has exceptionally light weight. Per Honda, the dry weight of the 954 is 370 pounds, and per Cycle World, their wet weight recorded was 429 pounds, which is lighter than both the 929RR that preceded it as well as the 1000RR that followed it, and is actually the same dry weight as the Honda CBR600 from that year. It actually wasn't until the 2017 to 2019 model CBR1000RR that the weight got even close to as light as the 954RR was, and even then it was a few pounds heavier. Here are a few of the things that Cycle World said about the 954 in their original review that stood out to me. The first was a remark from the project leader for Honda's open class CBR-RR series, which was the CBR must be a more versatile motorcycle that still has top performance, but is easier for the average person to ride on the street. We feel that one of the main competitors is more of a racetrack only, experts only machine. And then from their own remarks, Honda has created one of the sharpest, most maneuverable leader class rocket ships to ever hit the pavement, while still retaining the user friendliness of its predecessor. And additionally, they remarked on the 954's comparatively comfortable ergonomics, saying easing the pressure on the rider's wrists as well as offering more leverage with its more upright ergos. The 954 also boasts more legroom than the Gixxer 1000 to boot. So that was enough to sell me on looking for a CBR954RR specifically. Before I talk about some of the things I've liked about the 954 specifically, I'm going to talk about some things I like about Supersports in general. First off is they're just peak performance machines. There's something to be said for owning a machine that for its time was created to extract as much performance as possible. Another thing about Supersports is that they're always engineered to be exceptionally lightweight compared to other types of bikes. I found that as I start looking at other options for different types of bikes for what I would like to ride next, a lot of them are just heavier. Manufacturers in general put a lot of engineering and money into making Supersports as light as possible, much more so than other types of bikes, even other sporty bikes. If they're not a Supersport, they're generally not going to be as lightweight. And they're able to incorporate full fairings and wind protection while still keeping the weight down. Another nice thing about Supersports and sport bikes when compared to other segments like touring or adventure bikes is they have a very low center of gravity and seat height, which is probably the only livability benefit of Supersports generally, or the only thing that makes them a little bit more accessible to newer riders is that compared to something like my other bike, which is a Yamaha Tenere 700 middleweight adventure bike, that weighs 452 pounds wet, so it's not all that much heavier than the CBR, but because that weight is so much higher up and the seat height is so much higher, it's much more difficult to maneuver at low speed and much more intimidating for a newer rider, especially one that's not super tall. But the best thing about a Supersport is when you finally do get to a really nice windy road with smooth pavement, it is an amazing experience. The body position that makes it so uncomfortable to ride around normally is super engaging when you're cornering, and when you're mid-corner and you're leaned over and you're in that forward body position, it just feels like you're flying through the curve, and it's an incredible feeling. And then on top of that, you have the just excess of power and excess of RPMs, so you always have more at your disposal, which is an awesome feeling. And now for some of the things that I like specifically about the 954. The first one is the weight. I'm not going to go into that because I already touched on it. The next one is the ergonomics and seat height. So while the 954 has a seat height of 32.1 inches, a brand new CBR1000 will have a 32.6-inch seat height, so about a half-inch higher. Nothing crazy, but also generally the ergonomics for the rest of the bike are also going to be more aggressive and less comfortable. Next up is the fact that the 954 has no electronic rider aids. And that's something that, especially back when I got it, was really appealing to me, because I like the idea of knowing that it's just you and the bike. There's nothing between your operation and the bike's response, and knowing that whatever I was doing on the bike, it was because of my own skill. And then that also means that you have to have discipline as a new rider and really build up your skill slowly. But that is actually something that I've now not necessarily changed my mind overall on, but just for where I'm at in my life, I've kind of moved past that point. And next is the under-seat trunk in the 954, which is a really, really awesome creature comfort to have, especially on a super sport bike. It's not super big, but it is big enough to fit a couple snacks, a bottle of water. I've even had an extra set of shoes in there so I can change out of my riding boots. And so it's just big enough to have some actual meaningful items in it. And it's also really easy to access. It's just spring loaded, so you just turn the key, it pops open, you just close it, snap shut, which is super cool because on my Tenere, you can take the seat off, but it's much more of a two-handed exercise. You have to turn the key, then you have to remove the seat entirely, and then there's barely any space under the seat at all. So this actually, funny enough, has more practicality, built in at least, than the Tenere 700. And finally, the reliability. The 954, over the time that I've had it, has been almost perfectly reliable. The only issue that I've had with it is one of the front brake calipers had a one-way air leak coming through the bleeder screw. But it took me a while to figure out that's where the air was getting in. And long story short, after a long time, I realized that there was air getting into the system. I kept bleeding it, air kept getting in, and I eventually replaced that front caliper, and that fixed the problem. That may have been something that the previous owner had over-tightened that bleeder screw, so it might not really have been the bike's fault. But either way, that's the only reliability issue I've had with the bike. Now, as for the dislikes, I'll start again with kind of super sport bikes in general. So first one is going to be pretty obvious, it's comfort. The bike, as great as it is when you get to that awesome curvy road, the entire way there can be a bit of a chore, I would say. Personally, the type of rides I take are a lot of rides on more remote roads, country roads, sometimes out into the national forest, and these roads are not very well maintained. So the fact that they're longer rides means that the comfort comes into play a lot, and then the fact that they're less maintained means that the CBR is really not doing me any favors or my back, and there's times that the suspension will even bottom out over some of the bumps. So it's definitely not well suited necessarily for the type of riding that I'm doing on the way to the nice, smooth, curvy roads. The next downside I would say for super sports is it is psychologically more difficult to be stuck behind a slow vehicle than on, say, my Tenere 700, because the sport bike, everything about the bike, from the body position to the engine and transmission character, it wants to go fast. When you're going slow, there's more weight on your wrists because you're not accelerating, you don't have any wind resistance at lower speeds. The engine just doesn't feel right when you're just sitting at an RPM. It always wants to be revving up or engine braking and slowing you down. So it makes it more difficult when you're stuck behind a car that's going very slow. Just makes it a little bit more taxing. Now I'm going to talk about some of the dislikes that I had about the CBR in particular. So now this is actually going to be a little bit contradictory, but the first thing I'm going to talk about is the fact that there are no electronic rider aids. This is something that at this point in my life I've changed my opinion on, because now I'm a little bit older, I'm a father, and it's more important for me to make it back home than it is for me to know that I'm just the one riding and that I'm learning without guardrails. And I kind of already had my chance to do that. I've had the bike for years. I've learned, I haven't crashed it. The caveat to that might be if I was riding at a track with all the proper gear, then I would prefer, again, to have no rider aids. While overall, not having electronics, I've been okay. There was one time where I rolled on a little bit too aggressively to the throttle on the corner exit, and I did actually break traction on the rear tire. Luckily for me, it only slipped a matter of inches, but that's something that definitely opened my eyes and made me realize I need to be more careful, and also that it might be nice to have a safety net. My next dislike is the low range of the 954. Now this is something that Cycle World brought up in their test. They cited a 145 mile range course, that can vary based on how you're riding, but in my experience, the combination of relatively low range and having no real gas gauge has led to a lot of instances of me feeling like I constantly need to be filling up on those longer trips that I take in more remote areas. Every time I hit a gas station, I feel like I need to fill up just to make sure I can make it to the next one or make it home. And the last thing is just age. Now, this isn't really a knock on the CBR or any part of its design, but this is just a fact of life. It's at an age where things are just going to start breaking down no matter how well you maintain them. And I'm not really at a point in my life where I want to spend a lot of time working on the bike. And as it turns out, a lot of motorcycle mechanics also don't really like working on older bikes, or a lot of the shops in my area at least. So for that reason, the age is really starting to become a downside. Overall, Supersport motorcycles are incredible machines. The performance per dollar is unmatched compared to cars, and the 954 as the final Honda Fireblade is a great bike that I've loved owning. I think the combination of user friendliness and performance on the 954 is excellent, but unfortunately it is still a Supersport, which means it is seriously compromised as far as comfort is concerned, and it has way more power than I need at this point in my life. So as much as I've loved owning it, it's time for me to move on and get something that's a little more tame and has a little bit more of a safety net, and hopefully a little bit newer. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.